Hello, good afternoon and welcome to this session of the 2021 UKIO online conference. You can see something about me and all of our speakers by clicking on the names on your screen. But I'm Lord Rennard and I'm very happy to be called Chris. I do some work with AXREM, who've brought together a brilliant panel for this session. AXREM, you'll know, is the trade association representing the suppliers of diagnostic medical imaging, radiotherapy, healthcare IT, and care equipment in the UK. I'd like to be present with you all at the usual UKIO conference in Liverpool. It's my home city and, of course, the greatest place in the world to hold a conference. AXREM hopes to host a roundtable event such as this at all future conferences. The theme for today is implementing the transformative changes outlined in Sir Mike Richards' report from October 2020. This, of course, was called Recovery and Renewal, the report of the independent review of diagnostic services for NHS England. We'll be taking questions to all the participants in the last 15 minutes or so of this session. What I'd ask you all to do is to please post your questions online, and at the end of the session, I'll be directing them to the panelists. We're delighted to begin with the author of the report that we're discussing. Sir Mike Richards has already been engaged in the UKIO conference, persuading us all that community diagnostic hubs will increase access and improve quality. The vision of the Recovery and Renewal report is ambitious. So, Sir Mike, can you outline for us what that vision is?
Thank you very much indeed, and good afternoon, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. First of all, I think we need to recognise that diagnostics are vital for a whole broad range of indications. We need to identify people who are at future risk of disease. Genomics plays a large part in that. We need to detect people who have disease that's not yet causing symptoms. We may think of cancer screening and AAA screening, but also nowadays testing for asymptomatic COVID. Accurate and timely diagnosis of patients with symptoms. That's often the sort of meat of this in the centre. And then, equally important though, monitoring of response to treatment and toxicities of treatment. And then there are a whole range of conditions: cancer, heart disease, stroke, respiratory disease, musculoskeletal diseases, trauma, infectious diseases, etc. And then a very broad range of tests, all the imaging tests, endoscopy, physiological measurements, which is a broad range in itself, pathology, and genomics. And I think we would probably all agree that diagnostics should be available to all groups within the population, and that from a patient perspective, these tests should be delivered in a timely and convenient fashion with a one-stop service where that makes sense. It's not always the case. Of course, from a taxpayer point of view, we want everything to be as efficient as possible, highly productive, and recognising also that the service has got to be flexible so that we can incorporate new developments as soon as they arrive and have been properly evaluated. So that, you might say, is the vision of where we want to get to. But, and there is a big but, our services at the moment face very major challenges. Over the past few years, and I'm thinking pre-pandemic here, the demand for diagnostics has gone up in all areas. So in the A&E department, more and more people are needing CT scans of the head, the chest, the abdomen. Inpatients are requiring more investigations. The outpatient services, and also direct requests from GPs. All of those were increasing even before the pandemic. And in fact, the demand for diagnostics was going up faster than the demand in any one of those areas. And that's partly because there are new indications for the diagnostics, CT coronary angiography being an example. I think the threshold for investigating patients is going down, and that may be a very good thing from a patient point of view. And being reassured that you haven't got a problem can be very valuable. And so capacity in our service was really very stretched. I probably don't need to tell anybody that. Weights were increasing. We were needing to outsource more and more of our diagnostic services. We know that equipment availability is woefully poor by international standards. We are at the bottom end of an OECD league table, and the workforce is stretched very thinly, and we'll hear more about that. And on top of that, we have a very acute hospital-centred model for diagnostics. So my report can be boiled down to the following. First of all, we need to increase the capacity. We need more workforce. We need more equipment and better facilities. The second element is that we need to do things differently. And one of the key things we need to do there is, wherever it makes sense, to split the acute diagnostic services, those are the ones required for people in A&E or on inpatient wards, from elective diagnostics, those required for outpatients and for GP requests. And that's where community diagnostic hubs come into the vision. I'm not going to go through that again because we debated that, and I'm very glad to say that there was agreement, or large majority agreeing, that CDHs were a good model to go forward with. But remember, that's not it all. We do need to improve connectivity. We need better data. We've got some data for imaging, but we've got much less in the other aspects of diagnostics, and even that for imaging could be improved. We need to network much better. We need leadership at all levels, that is national, regional and system levels, and indeed in individual trusts as well. So I think there's a huge amount to be done. I'm really delighted that, first of all, the NHS England board has responded very positively to my report, that we now have a diagnostics programme board at national level. I'm glad we have a programme that is actually up and running. Very soon we will be announcing, I think, some successful applications for beginning to be our early adopters of the community diagnostic hub model. There's a lot of work going on between NHS England and Health Education England, thinking about the need for better workforce. So I'll just end by saying I think we're making a good start, having come from behind, if you like, and no more football analogies needed. But there is much more that needs to be done, and it's going to occupy all of us over the next few years, I suspect. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Mike. Your report has, of course, been debated in Parliament, generally very well received and welcomed. The issues we're going to discuss perhaps in the rest of this session are more about how we implement it. But I think it's fair to say that the general reaction to your report, because of your hard work, was that doing the same as we do today is not an option. We have to do better. And that's what we're going to try and discuss in the rest of our session. Now, we're going to move to a session about NHS leadership. And we're delighted to have the Director of Diagnostics, Medicines and Pharmacy at NHS England and Improvement, Andy Howlett, with us. Andy, the report by Sir Mike refers to underinvestment in diagnostic imaging technology over a long period of time. It says, as Mike has just said now, that the UK is at or near the bottom of most measures around availability and capacity for diagnostic tests like CT and MR. So the question, Andy, we'd like you to address, if you can please, is really, is the long-term investment going to be available to deliver the recommendations of the report? Thank you, Andy.
Thanks, Chris, and afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. So I've got the honour of being responsible for implementing the recommendations of Sir Mike's report, and I very much hope the answer to your question is yes. There will be the resources in place. However, so a bit more about that. So the National Diagnostic Programme has been successful in securing funding in each of the last 3 years. with a £200 million equipment replacement programme starting in 2019-20 and in two waves over 2 years. We also managed to secure investment in over 400 new assets as part of the NHS's COVID response, giving a boost to capacity of diagnostic imaging services in England. And this year we have nearly £500 million of capital investment secured through the spending review last autumn, as well as some ring-fence revenue resources. And I think it's worth reminding people that the NHS is uniquely in a position where it received an increased multi-year funding settlement for the NHS 70th birthday, whereas other public services are living more hand-to-mouth on annual spending settlements. And that settlement is there to support the delivery of the NHS Long Term Plan. And as Sir Mike's review highlights very clearly, a large number of the Long Term Plan commitments are dependent on diagnostic services. And therefore, there is a reasonable expectation that commissioners in the NHS will invest a proportion of that growth funding that they have over the next few years in increasing access to diagnostic services in order to support delivery of commitments around stroke, cardiac, respiratory and cancer, and improving clinical outcomes in those important clinical areas. The national team, however, won't rely solely on that existing settlement, and we will continue to make the case for additional funding, particularly capital, but also revenue support, particularly for the expanding the workforce. So Health Education England, who are responsible for commissioning training places in the workforce, sit outside that multi-year settlement. So there is still a need to secure resource for growing training places into the diagnostic services. And there was, again, last autumn, some significant welcome progress in that area. So I think the basic answer to your question is yes, there will be more money, and our investment priorities will be focused around the key areas highlighted in Sir Mike's report. So community diagnostic hubs will be a primary focus of the programme, and we hope to have a significant number of those mobilised this year with the resources that we have secured. We're also leading a significant investment programme in digital infrastructure, and I think across a number of the talks in UKIO's programme, the emphasis has been placed upon the need to integrate community diagnostic hubs into the wider NHS diagnostic services to avoid them becoming isolated islands of practice, and connecting the diagnostic information with the clinicians who need to use that information to support patient care. And we also want to sustain the progress that we've made in equipment replacement. So we need to get away from boom and bust and have a systematic year-on-year investment in keeping the asset base up to speed with modern technology and growing to meet the demands of the service. So a final point I'd like to make is, as well as investment, new investment, it's equally important that we maintain a focus on optimising the use of the resources that we already have. And there are a number of ways in which that can be progressed. And just to highlight a few areas, I think, and areas that we're promoting. One is optimising demand for imaging services by using the available clinical decision support tools so that we are ordering the right test first time, every time, and avoiding waste. Secondly, I think there's a big opportunity, and this is probably where the greatest opportunity is, to optimise the skill mix of our workforce, ensuring that our highly trained staff are working at the top of their licence, and that we're making use of our fantastic support workers to their full capability. And then finally, implementing diagnostic networks so that we are supporting clinical standardisation, collaboration, and levelling up access to services across the country.
Thanks very much, Andy. Your personal commitment and enthusiasm to delivering all of this, I'm sure, is very much welcomed by all of us. There were so many good points you made there, which I'm sure will resonate with everybody watching at the moment. I particularly think recognising that we need to replace some of the out-of-date equipment is one of the issues, simply because if we can actually get the most up-to-date equipment, we can deal with more people more quickly, more reliably, more efficiently. And when you're dealing with some very emotive subjects, cancer is only, of course, part of this. But it is so emotive that people are concerned at the moment about the backlog, the growing backlog because of COVID. Dealing with the diagnostic issues quickly and efficiently is, of course, supremely important to them. So thank you very much indeed for what you said. And we'll move on now to our third session, which is about national imaging leadership, with the National Special Advisor for Imaging, Dr. Sam Hare. I think what everyone's hoping from the report is it will be seen as a great opportunity to reset how we deliver diagnostic tests in the health service away from acute hospital sites. But this begs the question, why perhaps hasn't this been done before? People, I think, want to know what have been the barriers preventing this and how can we ensure that we don't go backwards? So Sam, perhaps you could do your best to try and enlighten us, please.
Thanks, Chris. So I think people have talked about this before, and we just haven't had the voice or platform to be able to deliver some of these things, because often, and wrongly so, the diagnostic modalities have been seen as a supporting cast or a speciality. So what Mike's report has done, however, is shine the light, and what COVID has done is shine the light on the fact that what I always say is without diagnosis, cannot make a diagnosis. So I often give an analogy. So if my father presents to accident and emergency with a tummy ache, gone are the days where perhaps a surgical consultant comes and puts his hand on my father's tummy and says, your father's got appendicitis. What will actually happen is my father's CT scan, I on call or in the day will report that scan and say it looks like this patient has got appendicitis, and then that report will then go to the surgical team and it will be actioned. So what I always say is, although it's always been happening, we've lost that sight in the NHS that in some ways imaging and conducting the orchestra of what happens in a hospital. Diagnostics is the hub of the hospital. It's the fact-finding speciality which then can filter out patients into they've got this disease or that disease, and then that leads to effective pathways further upstream. Why has this not been deliverable before? Partly because we haven't had the profile, because people fixate on how many operations have we done or how many chemotherapies have we given, and they've lost sight of the fact that you wouldn't give any operations or chemotherapies if you hadn't made the diagnosis using imaging, for example, in the first place. But what the COVID pandemic has highlighted is when all that stopped, when access to imaging and diagnostics in general, but imaging in particular, stopped, it was very difficult to make those cancer diagnoses or to tell patients that, or to start chemotherapy, because we had a bottleneck. Because number one, access to imaging and capacity is already constrained, but if you throw COVID on top, it just blocked the whole system. But in some ways, although COVID has obviously been a tragedy and it's been a terrible tragedy around the world, what it has highlighted is the importance of diagnostics. So actually, I would say now is the ideal time, and we've never had a more opportune time than now to deliver this. And Mike's articulated that brilliantly in the report. Not a single person I've talked to about the report has said the ideas in this report are not what we need to do. Everybody agrees that it is what we need to do. And I think we need to move away from why we cannot do things to why we can do things. And the reason we need to do these things ultimately is for our patients. So one of the things that Mike talks about is digital connectivity, and we know about community diagnostic hubs and separating an acute and elective care, but I want to give an analogy of a patient who has their diagnostic imaging, a CT scan at a local community hospital, and then goes to a larger hospital in the city for their chemotherapy. Now, currently, it's quite difficult. We do have ways of doing it to get that patient scan from the small hospital to the big hospital. But what Mike talks about in terms of digital connectivity is having a seamless integrated system of care where the images just travel around to different hospitals, which is how it should be, so that patients are not traveling to different hospitals and their imaging doesn't follow them seamlessly. And what I always say is patients already cross geographical boundaries, and we now need to develop our systems, particularly our imaging systems, to make sure that they can cross those geographical boundaries without any limits to their care because the imaging hasn't followed them, or led to a delayed appointment because the imaging hasn't arrived in time. So I think the reason that we've had a fear to do this before is finances, but Andy's articulated that quite well, that hopefully money will follow. Mike's articulated well why we need to do this and how we need to do it. And I think we're at the stage now where we have to do it because we have to upscale our imaging diagnostic services, not only in terms of capacity, but also in implementation and deliverability, to the point where, ultimately we can have any image, any place, any time, because that will create huge efficiencies in the system. So, for example, a patient who may have had a CT scan 2 weeks ago in Manchester, but comes for an appointment in a tertiary centre in London, for example, rather than have to repeat that imaging because you can't get hold of the one done 2 weeks before, it should just be there. And that's the type of thing I'm talking about. So what I'd like to finish by saying is we can erect lots of community diagnostic hubs and buy lots of new fancy equipment. But like a car, you can buy a fancy car, but if the motorway linkages to all the different cities are not effective, that car isn't going anywhere. And that's why the digital connectivity piece in this thing is probably the most integral thing that we need to do. But I just want to thank Mike for writing this report, because I think I've been in my career in imaging waiting for this for 20 years, and somebody's actually articulated what we need to do. So it's time to roll our sleeves up, have a positive attitude, and get it done now.
Thank you, Sam, for being a real champion for diagnostics and your kind words about this great report. I should perhaps say at this point, if people are following us, perhaps on Twitter, if you looked at the AXREM, AXREM Twitter feed at AXREM, or at the UKIO, that's at UKIO Congress, you can see some of what we're talking about on Twitter, and you can take part in the debate that way. But I'm hoping also that you will be posting within this conference some of your questions for the panelists at the end of our session. And we're now going to move to a section about the workforce, that's radiographers and radiologists. As I say, keep submitting your questions online, and we'll come to them at the end of all the presentations. We have two speakers for this section. We have from the Society and College of Radiographers, Richard Evans, and from the Royal College of Radiologists, Dr. Jeanette Dickson. They'll be talking one after the other about these issues. Richard and Jeanette, I should say, were also involved in the earlier plenary debate about community diagnostic hubs, and you can still find that session online if you want to. I'm going to start with Richard Evans. Richard, as you know, the report calls for an increase in the workforce of 4,000 radiographers. So the question we'd like you to try and address is just how do you think it's possible to scale up quickly to meet that scale of ambition? What barriers do you see, and how can we overcome them?
Well, thank you very much, Chris. And I'd like to echo Sam, actually, in saying this is an outstanding opportunity, a once in a career opportunity, I think, to see an expansion that we've known was needed for a very long time. And the workforce, of course, is absolutely key. We've suffered from decades of being under-provided with training places and capacity for educating radiographers and other members of the workforce. So that rapid expansion that you talk about, Chris, of sort of ramping up, is a real challenge. I think in the immediate term, and you can't just sort of switch on a tap and get someone with a 3-year or 4-year degree training just out tomorrow. That obviously is going to take time. So the immediate challenge, I think, is to continue to look wherever possible for a creative and well-supported overseas recruitment. We're fortunate that there are surpluses of radiographers in some countries around the world that are trained to a similar standard to the UK, and we want to work with those countries to support people coming from overseas to work in this country. There are obvious challenges right now because of COVID. There are obvious challenges right now because of Brexit, and the disquiet people feel around the world, I think, about coming to the UK for those reasons. However, we've also, obviously, as you say, got to ramp up our capacity for training radiographers. And the difficulties with that is really that it's not only about capacity in universities. That capacity, that higher education institutions do need to be properly resourced and they need to see it as worthwhile to train radiographers. That is not straightforward. They need to be properly resourced, and there needs to be a proper tariff for training radiographers so that it's an attractive course to put on. We know how fragile university education can be, with courses potentially being cancelled if there isn't enough income for the institutions, their businesses, obviously. But also there is a need for capacity in the workplace, and these workplaces are very, very hard pressed for all of the reasons that Mike has outlined in his report. This is why we need to see growth, but it's a bit of a vicious circle. How do you correct it? So we need people to be able to practice during their education, clinical placement practice. There is, I think, a role for technology in there, for simulation, for and for virtual reality experience, but it doesn't ultimately change the need that students need to be able to get into workplaces. There needs to be capacity in those workplaces to support people during their training, and so these are immediate challenges that need to be looked at, and we need to be looking for great leadership, both in universities and at local level, and great communication between those leaderships. Too often in the past, we haven't seen the right kind of communication between educators and clinical managers about what the requirements are and how those can be most creatively met. So there's a leadership challenge there. I don't know if you want to ask Dr. Dickson to comment up to this point. I could carry on for ages.
I'm sure you can. It's such an important topic. I note particularly what you said about how perhaps we need to recruit some radiologists from abroad where there is a surplus and where they're suitably trained to the standards we might want in NHS England. I think that's quite a topical issue at the minute and a point to keep pressing, and something I will take on board myself. What we might well do, if you don't mind, is come back to you in a moment, but I'm going to move to the similar question and ask Dr. Jeanette Dickson of the Royal College of Radiologists to address it. The report specifically calls for an increase in the workforce of 2,000 radiologists. So the same question as Richard's just been addressing: how quickly could we scale up to meet an ambition on that scale? What are the barriers and how do we overcome them? Jeanette, perhaps you can try to enlighten us with your thoughts, please.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for inviting me to talk on this situation, although Richard has covered a significant number of the points I would do it, but I will cover them from a slightly different angle. I think it's really important to understand that the pipeline for radiologists, as Richard says, there is an absolute immediate need, and we need to address that immediate need, but we need to look at how do we do a long-term sustainable solution. Radiologists take 5 years to train from entry into the specialty, but from medical school it's nearer 12. So it's about starting now to get there. And as Andy Howlett said earlier, we work in partnership with Health Education England and have a cap on the number of training places that we have available. That is 50% from Health Education England funded and 50% from individualised trusts. So we were really grateful last year to secure 110 extra training places, about a 10% uplift from Health Education England, which is a start. But we need to make that a multi-year settlement if we're going to bridge that workforce gap. However, we also need to engage with our local trusts and our local imaging providers that actually the local sustainable solution is what we need. We need that investment from the sustainability, from the people who are actually running the services. Now, that sounds a bit strange. Why wouldn't you want to invest in a service that you run? But actually, with teleradiology companies, with outsourcing, there is a perception that the money is in the system, it's being spent to provide the service. But actually, I think that money needs to be repurposed for the sustainability of the service internally, because actually, in many ways, the teleradiology pool is a finite pool. It's the same group of people, and you actually want them working within the system where they can deliver all that need done. And one of the things that needs done that is pertinent to this debate is training. You can't train people on a teleradiology company to deliver a fully functional imaging service. The trouble with radiologists, not a trouble, but the thing about radiologists is it's not just about interpreting the imaging. It's about the full breadth of service. It's about hands-on ultrasound. It's about intervention. It's about multidisciplinary team discussions for cancer. So you need to train people across a breadth, not just in reporting. So that training needs to be valued by the trust and by the doctors who are delivering that training. They need to feel that they are being supported to deliver that training in a time of service pressure. They also need to feel that they have the tools available to them to deliver that training. And that's, again, we've talked a bit about it, IT connectivity. It's about access to high quality training materials. And it's about the space and time to prepare that training. We also need to think about with radiology, we've invested in academies in a number of areas where we take the trainees and they spend half time in the academy doing theory and half time in the workplace learning the hands-on aspects of the training, looking at the other aspects of the service, but also seeing the leadership, seeing what that means, talking about service improvement and development. So we need to be able to actually to expand the academy model, because that's one of the ways of rapidly increasing training places. But we need to acknowledge that the academy model will not deliver all that it should deliver.
Thank you, Richard and Jeanette. It's good to know that the radiographers and the radiologists are all on the same page on this and all emphasising the importance of training. What we'll do is move on very shortly to our final section about technology, but I'll do a reminder again about the live question session. Someone's already posted a question. Thank you very much indeed. If you have questions to the panel, at the end of our session, the last session, which we're doing formally as a presentation about technology, I'll be putting to different panel members the various questions you're posting. I'll pick perhaps who I think might be most appropriate to answer it, but if you have a view about who you'd like to answer it, please try and indicate in your question as you post it. So finally, we're going to look at issues to do with technology. And again, we have two speakers. We have the chair and the vice chair of AXREM representing imaging and technology solution providers. That's Ela Dobson and Charles McCaffrey. I'm going to invite Ela and then Charles to comment in turn. As we've been discussing over the last half hour or so, the report is quite ambitious, doubling the NHS England CT scanning capacity and supplying 160 plus community diagnostic centres with MR, digital X-ray and ultrasound, as well as CT capability. Sounds like a huge challenge to me. So the question I'm going to put first to Ela and then to Charles is, speaking on behalf of the suppliers, are you up for this challenge? Ela.
Thank you, Chris, and hello, everyone. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for it's a really good question, and one that we're absolutely geared up in our industry to address. And I think I can start by saying how we've addressed, for example, the COVID situation and how quickly the suppliers that are within AXREM have accommodated that situation so very quickly. So, within a very short space of time, equipment like ventilators, patient monitors, ultrasound equipment, X-ray, CT, was brought into the marketplace very, very quickly, within a matter of weeks. In fact, I would say probably 3 or 4 years worth of equipment was put into the marketplace very quickly. Lots of things have been said about IT, for example, during this talk, and how that is a key part of making things happen. And we already started that process during the COVID situation, because whereas normally with all of our equipment, you would have online, not online training, but you would have face-to-face training. Our members were gearing up the equipment so that training could be done either remotely or even put onto the equipment itself. So, very, very fast ramp up, I would say. So yes, to answer your question very simply, absolutely, we're geared up. I would say that there are some key areas that our industry is very good at that I think what Mike's report calls for, we can absolutely help with. So, the digital transformation, for example, and having IT right at the cutting edge of what is required, so that, as Sam was pointing out, you want images when you want them, you want the information very quickly when you want it. The digital part of it and what our members and suppliers can do in technology, both with technology and the workforce, to make departments more intelligent and efficient, is much better for patients, for their outcomes, and easier for the staff to use as well in terms of equipment. So, and that also enables having, better optimization in the care pathway and driving quicker, diagnosis, so that there are not big gaps between having the diagnostic methods done on the equipment to the results coming out and the treatment taking place. Also, artificial intelligence is playing a big part, which again is part of the digital transformation. And I think all of those things is what our industry is good at, and is working hand in glove with all of the entities in the NHS. And for me, the biggest thing with Mike's report is that it's called for lots of things that had gaps. So not enough equipment, not enough workforce. We seem to be almost the lowest globally in all of those things. But all of everybody's geared up in order to make this happen, and in a very quick way. But the collaborative approach with which we're now working, which Mike's report calls for, is to me the biggest part of what the success of all of this is. Ali, do you want to add some more things to this?
Yes,
Charles,
yes, I'd like to. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Ela. Just another couple of comments I would add. I think there's a need for open and transparent procurement to ensure fair competition, innovation, and value for money is offered to the community diagnostic programme. So that for me is key, and obviously as a trade association, that's what we're all about. I think we should also use this unique opportunity, as many of the other speakers have said, to have sustainability as a key part of what we're doing. It's such a hot topic, sustainability. We should have a carbon zero approach to these community diagnostic hubs. We should be having solar panels on the roofs of all of them. We should be looking to minimise the impact they have on the environment. We should be looking for solutions which maintain those sustainability credentials throughout the lifetime of the equipment and not just at the start. I think that Ela touched on it, the role of artificial intelligence could be key, and it's not all about just doing the image interpretation, which often in our sphere the artificial intelligence is actually thought of about interpreting the image. We've got many very talented radiologists and radiographers who do that very well, and for many it's why they went into the job. That's only one part of the entire diagnostic process. How can we get artificial intelligence to improve clinical decision support tools, filtering out who gets referred to the CDHs, how we can predict who's going to turn up for their appointment and who isn't, and how can we remind them, send out text reminders and engage with them through mobile phone, because it's not just people of my age that will be treated in community diagnostics. It will be people of all ages, and they'll be expecting to be able to see things on their mobile phones and get their appointments that way, and to be able to get their preparation letters that way as well. So let's use artificial intelligence not only in the image interpretation, which has got a role there, but in the end-to-end solution. I think we also need realistic timescales for procurement. Andy talked earlier about the 200 million investment. The investment needs to be sustainable, but it also needs to be delivered in a timely fashion and with realistic lead times on equipment, because there is a finite capacity to the industry. There is a finite number of MR scanners, CT scanners that can be procured and can be delivered and installed at any time. And quite often, it's not the supplier community that's a bottleneck. Quite often it's the facility, it's the building works, it's getting access to the site, it's the site preparation and enabling works. And I was very pleased to hear Andy talk about boom and bust and the need for sustained investment, because I'm old enough to remember New Opportunities funding and the lottery funding and having these booms, and then all of a sudden those scanners are 15, 20 years old, and all of a sudden we're scrambling around to replace them. And also I think we need to be open and welcoming and engaging with the private sector in this project, because the suppliers like AXREM members have got a role to play, clearly. There's independent sector providers as well. There's private healthcare providers. There's construction companies. There are investors, and of course the NHS. So no one company, no one organisation will achieve this on its own. It's going to be part of a complete ecosystem coming together and working in partnership to deliver the requirements of Mike's programme. So that's all I was going to say, Chris. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Ela and Charles. And can I thank you both as the Chair and the Vice Chair of AXREM for arranging this round table, which I think has been excellent, for which I've learned a great deal, I have to say. Can I also thank Sally Edgington, the Director of AXREM, for busily tweeting from the @AXREM account about what we're discussing, and those involved from the @UKIO Congress Twitter account for doing the same. But can I also invite more of you to post your questions online in the forum for this debate, because we're now going to be taking questions to panel members. And the first question I'm going to try and direct in the direction of Andy Hewlett, at least in the first stage, is from Stuart Whitley, who says that apart from the capital funds to replace and add to the equipment inventory in the new facilities, will there be funding for additional costs for ongoing maintenance and replacement, and any upgrades to buildings when replacing equipment in older facilities? To be fair, I almost feel that should go to the Secretary of State or a Minister, but Andy, if you wouldn't mind doing your best in your professional capacity to answer that question, we'd be very grateful.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for the question. So I think I covered this in my talk earlier in the UKIO programme around the equipment replacement programme, and one big lesson we learnt from that was that when we make a bid for resources to government, we need to wrap the installation cost in with the cost of the equipment itself, so that it doesn't get forgotten or assumed that somebody else is picking up the tab for that. So in all of the financial planning that we're doing, we're including those costs. Of course, with replacement equipment activity, the maintenance costs, it should be part and parcel of the baseline. But obviously with new equipment, we need to ensure that we have budgeted for those ongoing costs of keeping the equipment functioning at its optimal performance.
Thanks for answering that as best you can. I think probably some more parliamentary questions will be following about these sorts of issues, trying to get more specific numbers and details and ongoing commitment. But thank you, as I say, for all that you do in relation to all of that. Now, I've had another question, which I'm just going to ask anyone on the panel who might want to comment on this. The question I had was, how can we make sustainability built into the design and delivery of community diagnostics and use the opportunity to increase diagnostic capacity whilst decreasing the impact on the environment? Now, that's stretching things a little further than perhaps our topic, but obviously people are concerned about issues like environmental sustainability. Perhaps someone from the panel might like to volunteer to deal with that issue about how we're going to make these. Thanks very much indeed. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd be delighted to answer that, Chris. And sitting here with a live moss wall behind me as well. So I think that this is a one-off opportunity that we have here. And I think that the lifespan of some of the equipment we're talking about here is in the region of about 7 to 10 years. So this is a significant opportunity for us, and people will judge us all on the success or otherwise. Most of the vendors who are members of AXREM, who have got large R&D investments into their product development, and most of the products that they're bringing out now are faster, with higher productivity, lower dose where they include radiation, higher image quality. They tend to be lower total cost of ownership over the lifetime, and they tend to be smaller and lighter and consume less power. So we have to harness that. We've got providers who provide MR scanners which don't require helium to cool the magnets. And helium, as you probably know, is a very scarce resource. And because it's scarce, the price of helium is rocketing. And so I think that we have to look at these things not just as an extension of the existing hospital, because let's face it, having that approach has really got us to where we are just now. We need to think differently. We need to think the environment the community diagnostic centres are going into in terms of access to public transport. How can we minimise the footprint and cars getting there? Can we have electric charge points for the cars when they're there? And the whole ecosystem of sustainability has to feature in the planning here. If we just put up temporary buildings, put in a couple of scanners in it and think that it's job done, I think we'll have failed.
Okay, thanks. So Mike, do you want to come back on that as well? Yeah.
Just to say, we do recognise this, and I'm very pleased to say that in the guidance on community diagnostic hubs, contribution towards net zero is written in as one of the key aims. So it's there, and we will then be challenging systems to say how are they doing that. And part of that, of course, is where you locate it and the public transport access. I'm not sure we've written into it about the electric charging points, but maybe we should. So thank you for that.
Thanks. And I also saw Sam and Jeanette wanted to come on this, so we'll move to the question in a minute, but Sam first and then Jeanette. And if you wouldn't mind keeping your answers brief, that'll allow more questions if they're put in, or otherwise I'm going to ask members of the panel to make some concluding remarks. But Sam first, please.
Yeah, just a quick point, Chris. So I always try and bring this back to patients. And so we can think about community diagnostic hubs at a pathway level. So if a patient can travel to a facility on one day and have 3 tests done, a blood test, a lung function test, and a CT scan, rather than making 3 separate trips to 3 separate sites, that's a good environmental impact at an individual patient level in terms of numbers of journeys required. So some pathway development once these buildings and scanners are placed is also something we need to think about.
Okay. If there are more questions coming in, please put them in the online section. What I am keen to do is to leave a couple of minutes at the end for Sir Mike to come back about anything we've said during this session, because I feel he should be allowed to sum up before we have a final closing. But I'm going to invite other panelists. They've all heard each other. I think we've had a very, very obviously well-informed debate. There's a lot of food for thought, things I will take away and I will act upon. But perhaps some panel members might like to give any reflections they have on some of the things we've been talking about so far. I'll come to Ela in a second as the chair of AXREM, just to ask Ela if you have any reflections on the presentations, contributions, questions we've had so far. Ela.
Thank you, Chris. I'd like to start by thanking everybody that's taken part in it. And I think for me, the coming together of everyone, well, firstly, for Mike to write the report in the first place, which includes absolutely everything that needs to be done to make our NHS the best in the world, to give our patients the best outcomes, is an absolutely superb thing. And I think this collaborative approach, just by the people that are on the panel today, shows how this is working and how everybody is coming together. So for me, the whole thing of different entities in the NHS, in the health service, coming together, making things happen and having better patient outcomes is a really fantastic outcome. And it's hit on all of the areas where we've had gaps. You know, equipment has been mentioned, workforce, IT, training. All of that is being now talked about in one single area, and solutions are being sought, which is absolutely superb. So for me, you know, this collaborative approach is going to result in a world-class NHS, which I'm really excited about.
Thanks, Ela. That's really appreciated. I'll come to Charles in a moment to reflect on some of the issues we've been discussing. But Richard, you haven't come back yet on any of the other panelists, and we cut you short a little bit to allow time earlier on. Richard, any reflections you have on the things we've been discussing over the last 50 minutes or so?
Thank you very much, Chris. Rather than just resume my little list of please can we haves, I think I'd like to pick up on Ela's comment about the teamwork that's required to make all of this happen. All imaging services depend on teamwork, and part of that team is the work with manufacturers as well as other disciplines within the clinical community. The diagnostic workforce team is going to be broader. I was really thankful that Mike highlighted the need for more assistant practitioners and more imaginative use of assistant practitioners in his report. So we're really keen to see that supported, and to make sure that what we can do together with our radiologists, with our medical physics colleagues, as well as the radiographic workforce, is deliver the patient-centred and safe environment that is required by our patients. So it's an inspiring time. It's hugely challenging, but who would not want to have that challenge and make it work? Of course, we all want to make it work.
Thanks, Richard. Of course, I found this session very inspiring personally, and I've learned a great deal from it. Charles, you know a lot about the things we were talking about during this session. Perhaps you give us a few reflections by way of just summarising the sort of things we've been talking about and the view from AXREM.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Yeah, I think I'd like to go back to the point that Sam made, which was about the IT infrastructure. If we do this right, this really could be world class, but it has to have the backbone of IT infrastructure underpinning it. It's not just about putting a CT scanner here or an MR scanner there, or an endoscopy suite there. It has to be joined up. We have to get the referrals coming into the system appropriately. These diagnostic centres will be located between trusts, which perhaps have got completely different electrics. They've got different PAS systems, different PAC systems, different RIS systems, and we all know the challenges and how cumbersome it can be to move data from one island to another, and we cannot create another 160 plus islands here. So my takeaway in this is the IT infrastructure should not be forgotten about, has to underpin this, and the modalities and the technology almost sits on top of that, as well as the artificial intelligence. So that's a key takeaway, and I think we have to have an appropriate but also light touch approach to a national image sharing solution, because I think we all still bear the scars from the Connecting for Health programme or the National Programme for IT, but I think there's a clear role, and we've seen that through the National COVID database. There are fairly simple and straightforward tools to enable that image sharing that Sam and Jeanette and Richards and colleagues need to access the data, and we need to keep that in mind. Let's not over-engineer it. Equally, let's not oversimplify it, but there's an appropriate level of infrastructure that we should put that in. And the AXREM suppliers are the companies who can do that. So we're keen to play a role in that. So that would be my reflections. But what an exciting time, Chris. I'm really excited.
Thanks, Charles. Really appreciate it. I have another question, which I'm going to throw, I'm afraid, the way of Andy Howlett, if he doesn't mind, but somebody else might pick on it if they want. This question, again, is talking about the CDHs. They're being planned, the community hubs. And the question is, will there be space for reporting suites so these scans and examinations can be reported in timely fashion? Is that possible to answer, Andy?
It is. I think our vision for how CDHs will operate in the longer term is that they will be connected to their local imaging network, and through the local imaging network they'll access a pool of a significant pool of reporting expertise with the radiological and advanced practice radiographer workforce of that network. In these days, remote working, and we're specifically promoting home working as a key recruitment and retention tool for reporting clinicians. That will be a real direction in the future, rather than planning in physical space in 160 plus new locations. Let's use virtual technology to access people where they are.
Thanks, Andy. And finally, and perhaps almost finally anyway, I want to come back to Sir Mike Richards, because his report was published in October 2020. The government responded in January 2021. Perhaps if you wouldn't, Mike, just for a couple of minutes, maybe you'd reflect on things since the government response of January 2021. How do you think the report's gone down? How do you think it's quickly going to be taken up, implemented? What are the immediate challenges? If you wouldn't mind, that's a very difficult question to put to you in a couple of minutes, but perhaps you could summarise a little bit of this session for us.
Well, thanks, Chris. I mean, first thing to say is I'm hugely encouraged about the degree of agreement within this panel, and indeed that I have heard much more widely than that across the sector. And that includes the manufacturers, it includes the independent sector providers, it includes people working at trust level and my colleagues at national level. So that there's a sense of this is the right direction. I think there is a sense that we have now made a start. I just want to say again, community diagnostic hubs are not the whole part of the diagnostics programme. I think they are one of 15 elements of the programme. And remember, there were 24 recommendations in my report. But they are a very important element of it, because that is where we can increase our capacity and do things differently. And I think we can, for example, start to meet the sustainability agenda with them. So we have made progress. I think there's been progress from NHS England and improvement. There's been progress from Health Education England. There's been progress through the regions, which have set up regional diagnostics program boards, and most of the integrated care systems have done the same. So there is, I think, activity at a lot of different levels, and indeed in a lot of individual trusts that are really thinking about how can we make this work for patients. We know that there are big challenges. They've all been mentioned. The workforce is going to be a really tricky one. We've been talking for years about getting staff to work at the top of their license. I think this is the opportunity to make that happen. I think in many cases, I've been hearing that we could do far more bringing in support workers at the lower bands in order to be able to make existing staff actually work at the top of their license. Richard has mentioned advanced practitioners and assistant practitioners. We need to do the whole different levels. Then there is funding. Of course, there's funding. Now, from my point of view, we have an important deadline, which is called the spending review this autumn. We need to be able to demonstrate that we have at least made a start by the time that the spending review comes round, so that we can, and I hope our parliamentary colleagues can also assist with this, we can make the case to the Department of Health and Social Care, to Number 10, but importantly also to the Treasury, of why we do need more funding here. And it's not just for diagnostics for diagnostics' sake, it is also so that we can achieve all of those outcomes we want to see improving, whether that's cancer or heart disease or stroke. I mean, this is for patient benefit, as has been said by several of my colleagues. So
absolutely,
there's a lot
Mike.
to be done.
That's brilliant. Thank you. I'm sorry we're going to have to sort of wrap up at that point, but that concluding point about the autumn spending review is, I think, crucially important for us all to try and address. I want to thank everyone for attending, in particular our brilliant panelists, Richard Evans, Dr. Jeanette Dickson, Dr. Sam Hare, Ela Dobson, Charlie McCaffrey, Andy Howlett, and of course you, Professor Sir Mike Richards. I must remind you to visit the partner portals. I have to say I've learned a tremendous amount from this session myself. I'll make good use of what I've learned, and I'm sure you will too. So on behalf of the AXREM organisation, can I thank everyone again, wish you a very good afternoon, and hopefully next year I might see you in Liverpool. In the meantime, do follow those Twitter accounts at AXREM and at UKIO Congress. Thank you all very much.